Let's talk about Todd's latest weird weapon that he did with me, and boar spears. This isn't a boar spear. Hey there folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now hopefully a lot of you will have seen that recently I did yet another in the series of weird weapons with my good friend Todd over on Todd's workshop channel. I'll stick the link below to that video in case you haven't seen it, but I'm sure most of you have by this point. So in that video, I don't know why I'm holding this up, well you'll see in a minute, but in that video we saw an amazing fold out polearm. Now that fold out polearm had two wings, we could say, or extensions which came just at the bottom of the blade. Now I don't own one of those, Todd owns it, but the blades essentially come out here. Now we referred to that as a SPETUM. You could describe it as a type of partisan. It can go actually by various different names, and one of the problems, as you've seen in my recent rapier videos, is that sometimes terminology is very fluid, and what they might refer to it in one place, one country, one land at that time, might be referred to as a completely different name in another place. Moreover, and this gets really horrible when you're trying to deal with primary sources, you'll find that they might use a name for it in that place, but then 100 years later they use a completely different name, and sometimes confusingly that name is now applied to a completely different weapon. It's really frustrating. So of course all of the conjecture began about what that weapon is, and I think we've more or less concluded that it's probably some type of fancy bodyguard's weapon, perhaps for taking in carriages or some other confined space, but nevertheless what we didn't know, what Todd and I didn't know when we made that video, was that there's actually a number of these. There's one at the Higgins, there's one in Madrid, there's one somewhere in Italy, so there's various of these spread around the world. Now it's possible, if they weren't authentic, if they were produced, let's say, in the 19th century, and this does happen unfortunately with some antique weapons, with medieval and Renaissance weapons, that they got sort of dispersed there, but I don't think that's the case. Having looked at the originals in those museums, and they're all classified as originals, they're almost certainly 16th century. Where they originate from, probably Italy, but I'm not completely certain on that. It's interesting that there's one in Spain, incidentally. So my estimation is they probably came from one source, perhaps a royal or ducal source, and they got sold in auction probably in the 19th century and ended up in a whole bunch of different collections around the world. But they probably all come from one particular set of bodyguards for a very high up noble, maybe a king or an emperor, but possibly for a duke or baron or something like that. But the question here is, what are they and what aren't they? Now specifically I want to talk here about boar spears, and the reason is, this isn't a completely dedicated video about boar spears, but over the years whenever we come up with polearms which have wings at the side, people in the comments, and the same is true, you can go and look in the comments under Todd's video, go, ah, it's a boar spear, it's for hunting. Now this is fundamentally incorrect. Okay, we know all about boar spears. There are lots of boar spears in museums and private collections. If you go to the Royal Armouries in Leeds, for example, I have filmed and photographed and documented all sorts of boar spears that they have there, and they are in a section for hunting weapons, and they are very different to this. What I'm holding here is essentially a late Dark Age, or should we say early medieval, winged spear. What you mustn't do is assume that any spear that has wings or lugs on it is necessarily for boar hunting, because we know that's not the case. We've got treatises, for example, Fiore de Liberi shows a winged spear being used in the early 15th century, and he calls it a ghiavarina. Now if we go forward to John Florio's dictionary of 1611, which is an English-Italian dictionary from the Elizabethan period, and look up the word ghiavarina, it's in there translated into English as spontoon. Now we know what a spontoon is. It's essentially, it's a form of partisan that was carried by sergeants as a way of keeping the men in line and as a weapon of personal defence as well. So forms of winged spear have been around throughout the Middle Ages from, let's say, about the 800s, possibly even late 700s, all the way through until the Renaissance, okay? And they come in many, many different forms. There's forms of partisan, SPETUM, rancer, blah, blah, blah. Absolutely loads of types of winged spears that aren't hunting spears per se. That's not to say you couldn't use them for hunting, but we have medieval art showing us boar hunting and deer hunting and other types of hunting, sometimes using spears from horseback and on foot. And we can see the types of spear that they're using. Now, just to confuse matters even further, boar spears were used in combat. In fact, it's shown in some art and even in a treatise I can think of in Talhofer, where we can see what appears to be a boar spear used in combat, because of course a hunting weapon can also be used as a weapon against humans sometimes. But fundamentally there's some big differences in design. Now the reason that I argue that Todd's weird weapon, whatever we want to call it there, is not a boar hunting spear are a few reasons. First of all, the blade is way too long. If we look at dedicated boar hunting spears, they have short, wide heads that are very thick. Okay, they're usually leaf shaped, and they are designed, they look a bit like an oversized lance point actually, and they're designed to cause a big wound channel, but they don't penetrate deeply into the boar until you meet the lugs. Now the lugs themselves, that's the next thing. On the weird weapon, these are very clearly large, long blades. On boar hunting spears, they are not large, long blades. They are literally like a crossguard. They are a stop rib. And in fact, some of those boar spears don't even have fixed lugs. They have a loop on the side here, and attached is a hanging lug, sometimes made of metal, or they attach, in fact, something made of an organic material, sometimes, ironically, boar tusk. So essentially you have a short, wide, thick spearhead, very robust, usually on an overly thick shaft, much thicker and heavier than you'd want for fighting with. You'll notice the width of the socket, the diameter of the socket is usually much bigger. A lug which is sometimes movable, sometimes fixed, but it's a blunt crosspiece. It's nothing like the wings that we find on winged spears, and it's certainly not bladed. And finally there's the issue of length as well. Now boar spears tend to not be massively long, but Todd's weird weapon I would say is shorter than most boar spears tend to be, although you do find some relatively short boar spears, so let's not make a big thing of the length. But the simple fact is the proportions, shape and design and the long-edged nature of that weird weapon means it's absolutely nothing like contemporary 16th century boar spears. And we have a lot of surviving boar spears, both in art and actually surviving in collections. So, what I want you to take away from this is, number one, I strongly believe that that weapon shown in Todd's Weird Weapons with me is not a boar hunting spear, number one. But number two, all lugged and winged spears aren't necessarily boar spears. This isn't a boar spear. This is a early medieval winged spear, or replica of an early medieval winged spear. If we look at Fiore's Giavarina, which is actually more similar to 15th century winged spears, obviously because that's what it is, but more similar to Todd's weird weapon, that is not a boar spear. It's specifically a combat spear for fighting against people on, you know, in armour, out of armour, on horseback, on foot. It's a combat weapon. And the same is true of partisans, as shown in Marozzo's treatise, for example. That is a fighting weapon. So just because something's got lugs doesn't mean it's got anything to do with boars. Finally, just to conclude, what I want to point out is what these lugs are for. Now, I've actually covered this more in depth in previous videos, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but fundamentally these are for fighting in the loosest sense of the word. So those are for blocking and trapping and controlling an opponent's weapon. So whereas a boar spear, for example, you'll notice that the lugs, you know, if we've got a big spearhead here, the lugs are quite close behind, okay? Because you don't want the boar running a long way up the shaft before it gets to the lugs. You don't want to penetrate through the boar and come way out the other side and then have it meet the lugs, because at that point it's going to be quite close to you. It's a different situation when we're talking about partisans, spetums and other winged spears, okay? Because you still want a fair amount of blade in front of you, but you also, with those weapons, want the ability to cut as well, which is completely irrelevant with a boar. If you look at boar spears, their cutting capacity is irrelevant. It's purely a stabbing weapon. You want to stab and pin the boar to the ground while other people come and stab it and finish it off or cut its throat or whatever you need to do. And it's usually being held by dogs at that point as well. The dogs grab it first, you come in with the spear, and then sometimes someone will come in with a knife. A fighting weapon, completely different. So these are for going against the other person's shaft. So one of the problems with spears is it's very easy for me to stab at someone with a spear and have them stab at me at the same time, and we both get skewered. The advantage of having these lugs at the side is you've got the ability to divert and push and manipulate the opponent's weapon in such a way, much like a crossguard on a sword, that you can protect yourself better at the same time as stabbing them. I'd also say in an early medieval context, these are probably also useful against spears. So against a shield wall, if that was such a thing in the period, there's a lot of debate about that, but against a shield wall, for example, you could, if you can't get your spear in, put your lug over the edge of the opponent's shield, pull their shield back, and then stab over the top. Equally, you could pull their legs or bits of equipment, belts, all this kind of stuff with those lugs. You can also, of course, pull someone off a horse with one as well, if they're designed right. And obviously, if we look at the lugs on things like halberds and bills, that's partially what they're designed for. Not so much the wings on winged spears, because they tend to go upwards rather than downwards. But not always, some of them go downwards. So there we go. Fundamentally, although they're superficially similar, there is a big functional and intention difference between a winged spear in all of its varieties, or a partisan, and a boar spear. Just because a spear has lugs doesn't mean that it's a boar spear. Okay, I hope that message gets around. Please share this video, because literally for years, I mean a decade now, I've seen people always saying that any spear with lugs on it must be for boar hunting. And this is a complete misconception. So we need to get the message out there that just because a spear's got lugs on does not mean it's for hunting. These, on this type of spear, on this particular spear, is for combat, is for fighting. This isn't a boar hunting spear. Boar hunting spears are a real thing, but they have a specific design and they're somewhat different to this or a partisan or a typical winged spear. Hope that's been interesting and useful to watch. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. And if you're not subscribed, make sure you do so right now. And I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. See you soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.